Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Before we dive into tonight's creepy story, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a scare. Now, let's get started. I was only 23, and in the moment, the thrill of taking a leap of faith for a girl I'd met on a dating app felt like a perfectly sane idea. Her name was Camille, a petite, artsy girl from a small town just outside of Paris. We'd talked almost every night for 2 months, and by the time I decided to visit, it felt like I already knew her. She was different from anyone I'd met before, sharp-witted, warm, a bit shy. The only issue was that her family was very traditional, which made inviting me to stay over at her place an impossibility. But that didn't bother me. I had already anticipated that and booked a cheap hostel close by. After a grueling 12-hour flight and navigating through Charles de Gaulle with only a few hours of intermittent sleep, I finally made it to the hostel around 3 in the morning. I was so out of it, the whole check-in process felt like a blur. The receptionist, an older woman with thick glasses and a suspicious expression, barely looked up as she handed me a keycard for my room, a shared 6-bed dorm on the 3rd floor. When I walked into the room, I was surprised to see someone already sitting on the bed opposite mine, even at this absurd hour. He was a thin, haggard man, probably in his mid-40s, with unkempt hair and a vacant expression. He didn't acknowledge me as I entered, and for a second, I wasn't even sure he was aware of my presence. Hi," I said, trying not to sound as disoriented as I felt. The man didn't respond. He just sat there, staring straight ahead at the wall, his eyes glassy and distant. I figured he must have been as exhausted as I was, so I didn't push it. I changed quickly and got into bed, glancing at him one last time before pulling the covers over myself. Even though he was sitting in the darkness, his eyes seemed oddly reflective, almost as if he was watching me through the faint light coming in from the window. It didn't take long before exhaustion pulled me under, and I fell asleep. But it was a restless kind of sleep, the kind where you're half aware of your surroundings, listening to every creak and shift around you. Around 5 in the morning, I was startled awake, my heart pounding inexplicably. I lay there for a second, staring up at the bunk above me, wondering what had woken me. I couldn't hear anything out of the ordinary, so I tried to convince myself it was just jet lag messing with my head. But as I started to close my eyes again, I realized something was off. The room was eerily quiet, so quiet I could hear the faintest sounds, a creak here, a whisper of movement there. I turned my head to glance around and noticed, to my confusion, that all the other beds were empty. Every single one. But that didn't make any sense. There was no way the man I'd seen earlier could have left the room without me hearing him. Trying to ignore the discomfort that settled into my gut, I lay back down and pulled the blanket tighter around me, willing myself to sleep. Just as my breathing started to slow, I felt a sudden vibration beneath me, a faint but unmistakable tremor that ran through the mattress. I froze, wide awake now, listening hard, and then I heard it, a slow, rhythmic breathing, oddly paced and irregular, coming from directly above. Swallowing back a wave of nausea, I forced myself to look up, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. What I saw sent a shiver down my spine. There, hanging upside down from the bunk above me, was the man from earlier, his face only inches away from mine, grinning. His eyes were wide, far too wide, glinting in the dim light like an animal's. I wanted to scream, but I was paralyzed, unable to tear my gaze away from his twisted smile. His mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear, as if he were whispering some strange, private joke meant only for him. His hands were clutching the sides of the bed, his body arched downward like a spider, holding himself up with an unnatural ease. Finally, I managed to find my voice and let out a terrified yell, stumbling out of bed and nearly tripping over myself in the process. My heart was hammering so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. The man didn't move, he just watched me, that eerie smile never fading. Without thinking, I reached for the light switch, flooding the room in a harsh, unforgiving glow. The man blinked, momentarily dazed, and for a split second, I thought he'd snap out of whatever trance he was in. But instead, he pulled out his phone, the screen casting an eerie blue light over his face, and snapped a photo of me. What the hell are you doing?" I stammered, barely able to process what was happening. He didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at his phone with a sickly satisfaction before slipping it into his pocket and walking out of the room without a single word. Shaking, I ran downstairs to the front desk, trying to explain what had just happened to the receptionist. She listened, her face impassive, as if I were recounting something as ordinary as a lost toothbrush. "I would like to switch rooms, please," I said, barely keeping the tremor out of my voice. "Or at least move to a private one." The receptionist sighed, glancing at the clock as if I'd inconvenienced her. "There are no refunds," she muttered, "but I can assign you to another dorm." She sounded indifferent, like she'd heard it all before. Part of me wanted to insist, to demand some kind of explanation or even a discount, but I didn't have the energy to fight. I accepted the key she gave me and tried to forget the entire encounter. Still, my mind kept drifting back to that man's face, the way he looked at me with that unsettling grin, the way he'd photographed me like I was some kind of specimen. Over the next few days, I tried to focus on my time with Camille. She was everything I'd hoped she would be in person: funny, smart, and understanding. We spent our days exploring the city, visiting art galleries and cozy cafes, but each night, a sense of dread crept back in as I returned to the hostel. I'd switched to a new dorm, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That trip still haunts me, and even now, years later, I still get shivers thinking about it. You know, it was supposed to be an adventure, a way to break out of my comfort zone and see the world with fresh eyes. But sometimes, stepping into the unknown can lead you to things you wish you'd never seen. It was my first time traveling alone. I'd saved up, planned carefully, and told myself I was ready for anything. I'd done my research and picked this little hostel in Chicago. Freedom Traveler's Nest, mostly because it had decent reviews, was affordable, and was close to downtown. It seemed perfect on paper, but things unraveled almost as soon as I arrived in the city. The trouble began right at the train station. I got lost, taking wrong turns, asking for directions but somehow always ending up more confused. After what felt like hours of lugging my suitcase around, I finally found the hostel. It was tucked down a quieter side street, not exactly in the heart of the action, but not too far out either. By that point, I was so exhausted I didn't pay too much attention to how the area seemed a little rundown, or how the building was dimly lit even though it was still only mid-afternoon. Once inside, there wasn't much of a check-in process. A tired-looking guy handed me a key and gestured to a rickety staircase. "Rooms upstairs. If you have anything valuable, best put it in the locker," he said, then added with a sort of half-hearted shrug. "Though, it's more for looks than security, to be honest." He laughed, and I forced a smile, a bit uneasy already. My room was on the 3rd floor, and it was exactly what you'd expect from a budget hostel. A few worn-out bunk beds, a questionable smell, and walls that seemed thinner than paper. But I reminded myself that I was just here to sleep. Besides, I wasn't planning on spending much time in the room. The hostel was only supposed to be a pit stop. There were 2 other guys already in the room when I walked in. They both looked up, studying me in a way that was oddly intense. They introduced themselves as Ben and Louis, brothers from, well, I think they mentioned somewhere in New York, though they had this heavy accent that made their English sound slightly off. They were friendly enough, at first anyway, even though I could tell they were sizing me up. I smiled, tried to be polite, and made some small talk about my trip, but as soon as I turned my back, I could hear them speaking softly in their language. And the strangest part was, I could understand a lot of what they were saying. I'd taken years of Italian in college, a decision I made on a whim but one that came in handy, apparently. They didn't know that, of course. As I unpacked, pretending not to understand, I realized they were talking about me. It wasn't anything blatant, just observations about my clothes, my luggage, even my watch. They chuckled, casting these sidelong glances my way. Something about their laughs gave me a bad feeling. But I thought, they're just messing around, maybe making fun of the clueless new guy. I ignored it. After a bit, they left the room, and I felt an odd sense of relief wash over me. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was just two guys, brothers probably, who were maybe a little strange, but ultimately harmless. Besides, this was Chicago. People here were direct, a little rough around the edges. I pushed the uneasy feeling aside, deciding to get a good night's sleep after exploring the city. Chicago itself was amazing. The bright city lights, bustling streets, that perfect blend of old-school architecture and modern skyscrapers. It felt like everything I'd hoped it would be. I spent hours wandering, snapping pictures, and losing myself in the sights and sounds of the city. By the time I got back to the hostel, I was exhausted but content, ready to call it a night. It was somewhere around midnight when it started. I was drifting in and out of sleep, lulled by the faint city noise filtering through the window, when I heard the door creak open. I kept my eyes closed, trying to ignore the sound. I figured it was just one of the brothers coming back late. But then I heard whispering, soft, quick, and urgent. I cracked when I opened and saw Ben and Louis standing near the foot of my bed, glancing at me and then back at each other. Something in their postures felt off, too tense, too calculated. I couldn't make out all of what they were saying, but I caught snippets. "Is he awake? Just do it quick." And then something about my bag. A cold knot formed in my stomach. They were planning to steal from me. My mind raced, but I forced myself to stay calm, to keep pretending I was asleep. Then, suddenly, the whispering stopped. The silence was thick, charged. I felt a prickle of awareness, that instinctive dread you get when you just know someone is watching you. I barely had time to react before I felt a damp cloth press hard against my face. The smell hit me instantly, sickly sweet, almost like a chemical. Chloroform. In that moment, something snapped in me. My survival instincts took over. I thrashed, twisting and turning, trying to break free. I managed to kick one of them hard enough that he staggered back, cursing. I screamed, a raw, desperate sound that echoed through the thin walls. The other guy panicked, trying to shove the cloth back, but I kept struggling, kicking, and screaming with everything I had. Finally, they stumbled back, eyes wide and wild, before bolting out the door. I was trembling, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. I grabbed my phone and ran down to the front desk, half expecting the brothers to be right behind me. But the lobby was empty, eerily quiet. The same tired guy from earlier looked up, startled as I practically crashed into the front desk. My words came out in a frantic rush as I told him what had happened. He frowned, looking confused. "Ben and Louis?" he repeated. "We don't have any guests by those names." The horror of it sank in like ice. They weren't even guests. They had just walked in, pretending to belong, biding their time until they could try to knock me out and take everything. After a shaky call to the police, I spent the rest of the night in the lobby, too scared to go back to my room. The officers arrived, took my statement, and assured me they'd check into it, though it was clear they didn't hold out much hope of finding those two. I checked out the next morning, my nerves still raw, and found another place to stay. But the damage was done. I'd wanted an adventure, and I'd gotten one, but it left me with a permanent sense of distrust, a lingering paranoia whenever I stayed in unfamiliar places. Even now, years later, I still get flashes of that night. Sometimes, when I'm alone in a quiet room, I think I hear a whisper, soft and sinister, echoing from the shadows. It's silly, I know. But that feeling never really goes away, that gnawing sense that someone, somewhere, is watching, waiting. And maybe, just maybe, next time I won't be so lucky. It was one of those sultry evenings in early December, when the air hangs heavy and warm, a stark contrast to the icy grip of winter back home. I had always dreamed of attending Art Basel in Miami Beach, and this year, I finally mustered the courage to go alone. After months of planning, I booked a cheap flight and a bed at Bikini Hostel, hoping to immerse myself in the vibrant atmosphere of the art scene while escaping the cold. Upon my arrival, the hostel's colorful exterior welcomed me like a warm hug. The walls were painted in bold hues, adorned with local artwork that flickered under the neon lights. Inside, the lobby buzzed with the chatter of travelers from all corners of the globe, laughter mixing with the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore. Despite the excitement, I felt a twinge of apprehension as I walked toward my dorm room. I had never stayed in a hostel before, and the idea of sharing a room with strangers was both thrilling and unnerving. The mixed-gender dorm was a spacious room with 8 beds, and as I entered, I noticed I was the only woman among the occupants. There was Leo, a jovial Australian backpacker, Kofi, a quiet student from Ghana, and 2 rowdy French guys named Julien and Etienne. They greeted me with smiles and casual introductions, putting my nerves at ease. After settling into my bunk, I joined them for a drink at the hostel bar, where we swapped stories about our travels and ambitions. The first night passed without incident, the laughter echoing in the hallways, music vibrating through the walls. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the energy of Miami turned electric, I slipped into the comfort of my bunk, cocooned in the soft sheets, the noise fading into a distant hum. Morning light streamed through the window when I awoke, stretching my limbs and blinking against the brightness. The day promised warmth and excitement, but as I reached for my phone to check the time, a wave of panic washed over me. My phone was gone. I bolted upright, scanning the room frantically. "Did anyone see my phone?" I asked, my voice tinged with alarm. The others shrugged, eyes wide with confusion. Kofi offered to help search, but we came up empty-handed. The lockers were locked tight, and my phone was nowhere in sight. The unease settled like a stone in my stomach. After a long morning of frantically checking every corner of the room and questioning my roommates, I turned to my only lifeline, my friend Mia, who was back home. Using her phone, I logged into Find My iPhone. Relief washed over me as I saw the little blue dot, the phone still at the hostel. But why couldn't I find it? Maybe someone picked it up by accident, Mia suggested, but a nagging feeling tugged at me. The more I thought about it, the more it felt deliberate. As I left the hostel to explore the city, the unease lingered in the back of my mind. That day was a whirlwind of art and culture. I wandered through galleries, soaking in the breathtaking creativity and vibrant energy that Art Basel exuded. But my heart wasn't in it. I kept glancing at my watch, the minutes ticking away, counting down until I could return to the hostel and check my phone again. When I finally did, I opened Find My iPhone once more. To my horror, the dot had moved. It was no longer in the hostel but somewhere nearby, an unsettling realization settling over me like a dark cloud. Someone had my phone, and they were moving around the area. My heart raced as I tried to quell the panic rising within me. Was I being followed? The thought was absurd, yet I couldn't shake it. I rushed back to the hostel, adrenaline coursing through my veins. As I entered the room, my breath caught in my throat. Sitting on the edge of my bunk was a man I hadn't seen before. He was tall, with an unkempt beard and piercing blue eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. My stomach twisted in knots as I realized he was the same man I had spotted earlier, lingering around the hostel, watching the guests with an unsettling intensity. I approached him cautiously, my heart pounding louder with every step. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Have you seen my phone? It went missing earlier today." He looked up, a flicker of recognition flashing in his eyes. I noticed a hint of guilt, but he shrugged nonchalantly. "Nope, haven't seen it." The casualness of his tone did little to quell my anxiety. Suddenly, I had an idea. "Can you call my phone?" I asked, a feigned confidence masking the fear coursing through me. He hesitated, glancing around the room. "Why would I do that?" At that moment, I gestured to Kofi, who had just walked in. "Kofi, can you help me out?" I called, my voice louder now, desperate. Kofi nodded, pulling out his own phone. I could see the man's expression shift, panic flashing across his face. He stood up, backing away as Kofi dialed my number. The familiar ringtone echoed through the room, loud and clear. The sound seemed to pulse in the air, resonating with the dread I felt. It was coming from the man's pocket. I felt a chill race down my spine, adrenaline making me feel both light and heavy. "It's in your pocket," I said, pointing, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my insides. He froze, the weight of his guilt crashing down around him. With a reluctant sigh, he pulled my phone from his pocket, the screen lighting up with a notification. "Here," he muttered, his voice low and almost defeated. "I was just what?" I interrupted, the anger bubbling up inside me. "Just stealing it? You have no idea how invasive that is." As he handed it over, I felt a rush of triumph mixed with disbelief. How could someone be so brazen? But before I could say another word, he bolted from the room, slipping past Kofi and out into the hallway. My heart still raced, but relief flooded in as I clutched my phone, the familiar weight of it reassuring. "What just happened?" Kofi asked, bewildered. I took a deep breath, the adrenaline still coursing through me. "I think he was watching me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "He knew I was alone and took my phone when I wasn't looking." Mark, who had just entered, looked between us. "Are you okay?" "I am now," I replied, shaking slightly. "But I can't believe it. I feel so violated." The three of us exchanged concerned glances, and it was then that I realized how grateful I was to have them there. The fear subsided into a cautious camaraderie, a shared understanding that we were all in this together. After a few minutes of debriefing, I decided I didn't want to let this incident ruin my trip. I needed to shake off the unease and enjoy the evening. "Let's go out," I suggested, and to my surprise, Kofi and Mark agreed enthusiastically. We found ourselves at a local bar, the atmosphere buzzing with energy, music pulsing through the air as people danced and mingled. It was a stark contrast to the fear that had gripped me earlier, and as I sipped my drink, I felt the tension start to dissipate. Laughter bubbled up among us, stories were shared, and for a moment, I felt safe again. As the night wore on, I let myself relax, embracing the warmth of new friendships and the vibrant culture surrounding me. The hostel incident had shaken me, but it had also ignited a fire within me, a determination to reclaim my experience. I knew I had to remain vigilant, but I also refused to let fear dictate my adventure. Later that night, as we walked along the beach, the moonlight shimmering on the waves, I took a deep breath, savoring the salty air. "You know," I said, looking out at the ocean, "that was a really scary experience, but it's made me appreciate this moment even more. I'm lucky to have you guys." Mark smiled, nudging my shoulder playfully. "Just remember, always keep your stuff close. We've got your back." I nodded, grateful for their support. As we laughed and talked late into the night, the shadows of that earlier encounter faded away, replaced by the warmth of friendship and the joy of experiencing life to the fullest.